Okay, I'm sorry. Uh, there are lots of things that we don't think the world has to share with our understanding of it. So we don't think the world has to be in English, for instance, even if we're using English to understand it. And part of the reason we don't think that is because we say, well, you could understand it in German or in some other language. We can think about it in other languages. Heidegger's claim that if you're thinking about philosophy, you can really only do it in German or Greek is a separate issue. And the status of the language of mathematics as the language we need to understand the material world in is not unrelated. It's in a way a special case of this question. But all those things on the side of appearances are languages. They share whatever it is in virtue of which they're substantially intertranslatable, for instance, which is what makes it possible for us to use expressions in our own language, in our use language, as the illustrating sign designs in functionally classifying dot-quoted expressions, characterizing the functional roles of things in other languages. Whatever it is that all those languages or vocabularies share is a good thing to mean by conceptual content or conceptual structure. Here you can think of the Sellarsian slogan that grasp or understanding of a concept is mastery of the use of a word. So the challenge that Sellars is facing is to make sense of the use of things that share that structure, things that are in conceptual shape, to express an understanding of a world that is not in that shape. A world in the narrow sense, as he says, that has no native language, a world that's not conceptually structured. The language of a transcendental logic in Sellars' use of that Kantian phrase, talking about it's transcendental in that it expresses the relation between appearance and reality, would have to, in some sense, express what was common to the conceptually structured appearance and the non-conceptual world. Now, having sensitized ourselves to the difference between thinking of the relation between appearance and reality in categories of resemblance and thinking of it in the broader categories of representation, when we talk loosely about what's in common between these, we don't expect it to be atomistic, sort of point-by-point, local sharing of anything. We expect it to be global, holistic. That's what we have in mind when we talk about it as a structural matter. But following Kant and disagreeing with Hegel, Sellars takes it, first of all, that shared structure is not itself conceptual. It's to be specifiable in a language that's fit to describe only the world, the material world, in the narrow sense, which doesn't include conceptual things. So there's a big metaphysical fork in the road. If we go with, the first fork is, well, do we think of the real as in conceptual shape or not? I want to next time talk about that alternative, but Sellars faced a fork in the road downstream, having decided that the world in the narrow sense was not in conceptual shape. Is the relation between the conceptual and the non-conceptual to be thought of as conceptually structured or as non-conceptual? And he said non-conceptual. So just to be clear, we got three things here. We've got the discursive practices, vocabularies, languages, thought, talk. We've got the world, the material world that we're talking and thinking about, and though it's not coming up in this discussion of Sellars, acting in. And then the third thing is the relation between them. And for each of them, the question conceptual shape or non-conceptual shape comes up. So the challenge is to acknowledge the differences between vocabularies and what they're about, while making it intelligible that vocabulary should express an understanding of the non-vocabularies they let us talk and think about. Now, I'm struck here at this level from 10,000 feet up of what the issue is, of an expression of what seems to me recognizably the same view in Wallace Stevens' famous poem, The Blue Guitar, which starts off, they said, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." The man replied, "Things as they are changed upon my blue guitar." And they said, "But play you must, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves, a tune upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are." Stevens is usually read as talking about poetry. I'm suggesting we can think about the blue guitar as languages, as the conceptual, and the same questions come up. Things change when played upon the blue guitar, but we want them to say exactly how things are. Okay, descending from the view from 10,000 feet up, can we get a little more definite about this issue? One paradigm of picturing, Sellars' name for this relation between the conceptual and the non-conceptual, is maps. And some things Sellars says suggest that he thinks of this as a good example anyway. And here's how I think maps should be understood. I think understanding a map is mastering a set of inferences, inferences relating to vocabularies. There's the vocabulary in which you specify map facts, that there's a square dot here and a round dot here and a wiggly blue line in between them. Those are map facts. And the terrain vocabulary, the vocabulary in which you specify terrain facts about rivers and cities and mountains and so on. And being able to read the map, to understand the map, to treat it as a map, is to be able systematically to make inferences from map facts to terrain facts. Now, not every fact about the map is a map fact. My map of Pittsburgh has got a round coffee stain on it, and being able to read the map is to know you describe it in a vocabulary, a map vocabulary, that doesn't include that coffee stain, because there's no inferential move to be made from it, no information in that sense encapsulated in it. And of course, there's lots of things about the terrain that no particular map is indicating, and so are not going to be in the vocabulary in which you specify terrain facts for the purpose of drawing inferences about them from map facts. Maybe the state of pollution on that day is not part of what's mapped by the map that you're looking at. Maps are special, and maybe we should worry about this, in that they're a distinctive combination of resemblance and representation. They're resemblance because they're both using geometric facts. The wavy blue line is between the square dot and the round dot. There's a river between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Um, but the distances are proportional. That's the scale of the map. That's a matter of resemblance. There's shared properties, albeit scaled, but we're mapping geometrical things with geometrical things. That's a matter of resemblance. But the fact that the dot that, as we say, represents Pittsburgh is square, and the one that represents Philadelphia is round because of the different populations of the cities, let's say, that's a representational matter. There's no resemblance of what's represented and the representing of it. Now, I hope that's sort of clear enough and recognizable enough as an account of what it is to understand, be able to read a map of what the mapping relation consists in. But now, Sellars, because of his collateral philosophical commitments, is severely constrained in the language he can use to describe that mapping relation. And that's what I was talking about as a transcendental vocabulary. We think of the map as an appearance of the terrain that is a reality. Sellars has three commitments that constrain him here. First, to metalinguistic analyses of property talk, relation talk, fact talk, and sort of inference talk. And second, to excluding from the world in the narrow sense any expressions that are properly analyzed metalinguistically. And third, to the picturing relation being in the world in the narrow sense. So those three things mean he can't use any expressions that he understands metalinguistically in specifying the picturing relation. And I think those expressive restrictions on the language in which picturing is specified collide with three features of the mapping model of picturing, anyway. So first, the inferences from map facts to terrain facts, like all inferences, are norm governed. And we can see the trace of that normativity in the fact that there's a normative direction of fit. If the inference from the map fact to the terrain fact leads you from a fact to a mere false claim about the terrain, then, assuming you've made the inference correctly, the map is wrong, not the terrain. The terrain sets a normative standard for assessment of the correctness of the map. But norms aren't in the world in the narrow sense. So that feature is going to be hard to reproduce according to the rules of the game that Sellars is playing, according to the constraints on a solution that he's got. Second, the inferences connect map facts to terrain facts. It's an inference from the fact that there's a wavy blue line between these two dots, from which you can infer that there's a river between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. But Sellars doesn't allow facts in the world in the narrow sense. And third, map inferences, what corresponds to a method of projection, indeed talking about a method of projection, the root of that metaphor is in maps. In a Mercator projection, for instance, is telling you which inferences you can make. You can make inferences about shape from the map fact about the Mercator map to the terrain. but not about area, for instance. But these methods of projection, the inferences, are essentially subjunctively robust. That is, to have mastered those inferences, you need to know what it would mean if the dot that represents Pittsburgh were a circle instead of a square. That would mean that it had a population over 2 million, let's say, even though it doesn't. But you can't really read the map unless you can make these subjunctive inferences about what would follow about the terrain if some constellation of features of the map were different. But what's expressed by subjunctive conditionals, that on Sellars' official reading, that's a metalinguistic affair. Those alethic modal connections are not in the world in the narrow sense. There's only what he calls, following Hume, regularities, but not these law-like regularities. So all the work that's done by the invocation of inferential norms, the invocation of facts as the termini of the relation, and the subjunctive robustness of the method of projection of the inferences that you make. All of that has to be done in this spare nominalist language in order to satisfy the criteria of adequacy that he's laid down for an account of picturing, for an account of the relation between non-conceptual appearances and conceptual appearances and non-conceptual reality. And I might notice in passing that one side of the picturing relation, the natural linguistic objects side, is itself produced, you can think about the diagram, it's the shadow of regularities that are induced by the norms governing the use of those expressions. And that method of projection also is essentially subjunctively robust. It needs to be, because we just don't chatter enough about what there is in the world. We've got to look at what utterances the norms would license or require if we were to be talking about things. So this is going to happen in understanding the regularities at the level of the natural linguistic objects already before we worry about the relation between them and what they represent. And all of this puts the focus on the concept that's got to bear all the weight for a nominalist metaphysics here, which is what resources can the nominalist allow herself in combining or arranging particulars, typically to make new particulars, because it's going to be those arrangements or combinations or regularities thought of as constant conjunction of natural linguistic objects on the one hand and particulars in the world on the other. So there's a detailed sort of specification of an intellectual philosophical task, a set of criteria of adequacy, and a very spare set of resources that need to be deployed on the basis of which constructions can be made to satisfy those criteria of adequacy. And we've seen other nominalists appeal at this point to mereology and say, well, we're nominalists because there are things we find unintelligible or objectionable about set theoretic ways of combining some particulars into other particulars, elements into sets. I rehearsed some of those objections. I included the original Nelson and Goodman paper in the supplementary reading, so you could look at some others. But mereology is a place people have gone. They say don't look at the set element relation, look at the whole part relation. And here is a formalism that lets us do that. Now, Sellars mentions mereology. He rejects the Goodman-Nelson mereology, and he doesn't tell us why, but I think we can conjecture what difficulties he has with it. Mereology, like set theory, allows combination of arbitrary particulars into new wholes. So my left little finger, a photon outside of our light cone, and Julius Caesar, you can combine all of those into a mereological whole. That's too indiscriminate for a mode of combination to do the work that Sellars wants to have done. Second important point is there's no account of alteration of particulars in mereology. You can understand two wholes as related to one another in that one has a part the other one doesn't, or is missing a part the other one does have. But the mereological wholes themselves don't change. For instance, moving the parts around in space and time does not change the mereological whole that they make up. And as a result, you really can't identify any ordinary object, or indeed a scientific object, with the mereological sum of any other ordinary or scientific object, because all of those would be altered by changing the spatiotemporal relations among the parts. The ordinary or scientific objects would be changed in a way that's not represented in the mereological representation of wholes. I'll mention one other thing just because people, one of the objections to set theory is when you move from concrete set theory, where the Ur elements are actual objects, to pure set theory, well, we're going to count the empty set as a set, and so we have to count its singleton as a set, and the doubleton that is the empty set, and the singleton of the empty set is yet another set, and they say, look, that this is inappropriately fecund as a way of forming objects. But in almost all versions of mereology, there's a null object, which is understood as a part of every object. All objects have got a common part. And this is, you say, well, what does that correspond to in my understanding of wholes and parts? You say, well, none, but we need it for technical convenience in doing mereology. Well, that's the sort of thing that people were, the nominalists were objecting to about set theory. Yeah, your technical requirements are leading you ontologically astray. They're leading you to postulate things that aren't really there, like the null part, which I'll just mention in passing. In the metaphysical universe that Kit finds, truthmaker semantics is defined on. That's a mereological universe of states, otherwise unspecified, and mereological sums of them. He absolutely needs the null state, So there are complaints about Mariology from the point of view of ontological ascetic, such as is motivating the nominalist, that are analogous anyway to some of the complaints about set theory. At any rate, I conjecture that this is why Sellars doesn't think classical Mariology is a good contender for ways in which material particulars can be combined into other material particulars. That's not what it's doing. Now, he speaks well of plurals as a kind of nominalistically acceptable one in many. In addition to Leo the lion and Leonina the lion, there's lions. And though he doesn't particularly go into the plural quantifiers, he's presumably happy with all the lions as just another way of talking about those particular lions. It's just a plural way of talking about them. But in admitting lions, as well as the individual lions, that's not crossing a nominalistic boundary for him. Another piece that I put in the supplementary reading is the essay by David Lewis, summarizing the gist of his early 90s book on megathology as a successor version of Mariology that puts those two things together. It adds to Mariology plural quantifiers as George Boulos gave us a formal grip on them. And Lewis thinks each of those is nominalistically acceptable, and he's excited by, he's concerned to show that the expressive power that you get from combining both of them, that's what he means by megathology, is Mariology plus plural quantifiers, though not strictly comparable to the expressive power of set theory, is roughly comparable. Mathematics is Megathology is the title of the article because he shows how much mathematics you can get. Basically, he's arguing all of it from this. But that's going in the wrong direction for Sellars. He wants something that's closer to just the plurals as a way of combining individuals. I put the second Simonelli article in the main reading for this week. I hope I'll get to talk about the details of it because I think he shows convincingly that the reason, the motivation for Sellars' late turn to a process ontology is precisely to solve this task of getting an account of how you can combine particulars into particulars in a nominalistically acceptable way that has the sort of expressive power that could make sense of a relation of picturing, that it would get enough of, well, I was suggesting 3 dimensions where the mapping picture requires a richer modes of combination, richer kinds of ones in many than Sellars' metalinguistic scruples will allow him. And the key thought seems to be that for processes, you can't just combine 2 arbitrary processes into another process. There's going to be a conception of what kind of unity a process has. I've been talking about mereological fusion, putting 2 things together to make a third thing, but you can equally think, these are just equivalent ways of thinking, of mereology in terms of the part-whole relation. That is, there are constraints on when one process is a sub-process of another. So if you think about the process that is the Second World War, the process that is the Battle of Stalingrad is a sub-process of it. But the process that is, I don't know, my boiling of an egg isn't a sub-process of the Second World War. There probably are egg boilings that are sub-processes of it, but my egg boiling this morning was not one of them. There's constraints on it. And the overarching idea seems to be that a proper process ontology will have as part of it, as an output of it, a notion of a one in many, the sense in which one process can contain other processes as sub-processes, that would be expressively rich enough to do the job that he needs in defining picturing. I mean, on that telling of the story, which I'm convinced by, this was eye-opening to me, this Simonelli argument, which I might mention in passing. The last time I talked about Sellars, not particularly about this stuff, mostly what we did in the first half of the course, was in a seminar in 2019. That paper was his term paper for that course. Last week we read a more recent piece of his on the two worlds conception. That was just, well, thinking about Sellars some years on. He came up with that. But on this account, which I think is compelling, this is the line of thought, I think, that must be responsible for Sellars' late turn to a process ontology. Everything turns on what the constraints on sub-processes are. And that's something that he makes an effort towards in the last section of the second Harris lecture. I wish I could tell you I understood what those constraints were and what the process ontology came to as applied to this question, what are the constraints on sub-processes? The carbon-based life form that has thought hardest about this is one of Sellars' last students, Johanna Seibt, here at Pittsburgh, who has made a career of thinking first about Sellars on processes and then in her own right about process ontologies, and has different formal systems that are Mereology-like, I will say. She calls them Mereologies, but that are specific to processes. At any rate, introducing this ontology and telling us something about this relation, that's what he's doing in this second Karras lecture. And if one doesn't realize that, it's really hard to see how the different parts hang together. So that's the framework that I want to put around our reading of some of the particulars of this lecture. I mean, let me say something about Sellars' Karras lectures. I mean, these lectures are in a way like the Locke lectures. They're supposed to be given every other year in the even years at the APA. It's 3 lectures, and a bunch of eminent people have done this. Sellars was invited to do it for 78. And 2 months beforehand, he called up the APA people and said, I'm not ready. We got to do it next year. And the next year, a month before the Eastern APA, he called them up and said, I'm still not ready. We're going to have to postpone it. And they said, okay, but this is the last time, next time, or you can't do it. And so we have these three, in many ways, disparate lectures. The first of them, The Lever of Archimedes, is his account of how he would make some of the points in EPM now, but with a particular emphasis on sense impressions. The middle one introduces this process ontology. As we'll see, the middle one, the one we read, introduces it into the manifest image. And here now in late 70s, I think comes out in 81, he's unapologetically using manifest image, scientific image language again, as he did in PSIM, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, which I realize I omitted to mention when we first read it, that it was given as 2 lectures at the University of Pittsburgh in 1960. It was basically his job talk for moving from Yale to Pittsburgh. They invited him to give these lectures, and so they could look him over and they could make a pitch to him that became successful 2 years later when he came. At any rate, the Karras lectures were sort of difficult for him. I was able to go to them. They were at the Eastern APA. I didn't go to the third one. I couldn't face it after, perhaps you can imagine, listening to this as a lecture. But worse than that, Sellars, who was not just a classroom teacher for his whole professional life, but was an absolutely spellbinding, charismatic undergraduate lecturer. Just the energy, the passion that he had made you care about these tiny distinctions he was making, these subtle distinctions that he was making. But when it came to giving a talk to his professional peers, all of that disappeared. And he read what he had in front of him. And as I say, this man had been a classroom teacher his entire life. Most of this lecture was actually inaudible because he stood with his nose up against the blackboard, talking while he wrote at the blackboard. So not only was it difficult to understand when you knew what the words were, but it was practically impossible to know what the words were. So as devoted as I was and am to him, I just couldn't face going to the third of these lectures, and hardly anybody else did either. At any rate, I think I know roughly what's going on in this lecture, at least at large scale, with the exception of the final part that I'll get to. So where we're going in this, if you have the text of the passages I extracted available, it would be good to look at them. But in sections 102 and 103, he says, we see that the world we have been constructing is one in which every basic state of affairs is expressed by the use of verbs and adverbs. Nominalism was supposed to say only what's expressed by singular terms really exists, but he's saying the higher nominalism, every basic state of affairs is expressed by the use of verbs and adverbs. Basic in there is redundant because the other ones are built up out of these, so it's all verbs and adverbs. We have in barest outline a truly Heraclitean ontology. Panta rei, all things flow. There are no objects. The world is an ongoing tissue of goings on. Now, Sellars emphasizes at several places at the beginning and as he's going along that what he's reconstructing in these process terms is the manifest image. What he does in the third lecture is consider reconstructing the scientific image in the same way. And there he's worried about what absolute processes might look like in the scientific image. So this discussion in the second of the Keras lectures is a bit of a ladder. It's a way station for him to introduce the idea of a process ontology. Indeed, as we'll see, an ontology of absolute processes. And I'll say, sometimes he says pure processes, but here he introduces it with the notion of absolute. And at a number of places, he asks, well, what is the relation of this reconstruction that I'm giving you to the manifest image? And he says in 7, first of several remarks, thus I shall assume without argument that philosophical insight is gained essentially by confronting discourse about man in the world, so the manifest image, with tidy if provisional conceptual models, which we understand because we have constructed them. I shall not, however, attempt to explain the nature of this confrontation, other than to say that it generates the philosophical dialectic, nor how it makes possible the desired insight. So you say, okay, you're giving us a reconstruction of the manifest image in terms that can be expressed entirely using verbs and adverbs. What's the relation between the reconstruction and the original? And he says, well, I'm basically not going to tell you what that is, just take my word for it, it'll be illuminating. But later on, after he's gotten more of this on board, section 95, he says, well, start at 92. A final point for future reference before we put this alternative framework to use. The correlations of which we've been speaking between statements in the two frameworks, that is, in an objects and their changes framework that he takes to be the framework of the original manifest image, and his new framework. The correlations of which we've been speaking need not be viewed as offering an analysis of manifest statements, i.e. as preserving sense. As a not unrelated point, it should be noticed that to identify manifest water with volumes of H2O also is not to analyze statements about water into statements about H2O. Nor is it, more than superficially, to establish a correlation between manifest water and its observable properties on the one hand, and H2O and its theoretical properties on the other. Here's the 95. It's rather to say that one framework is, with appropriate adjustments in the larger context, replaceable by the other, eliminable in favor of the other. The replacement would be justified by the greater explanatory power of the new framework. Well, explanatory power, what really justifies the replacement is, he thinks, the ontological parsimony, the fact that you would only be talking about the kind of thing that could really exist. Um, so he says the logical atomists might similarly claim that the correlations of which they speak are to be viewed as a possible replacement of the manifest image by a framework having the ontological texture of their regulative ideal, roughly that of the Tractatus. This replaceability in principle would be justified by a consilience of metaphysical considerations. And then he says, oh, let's take this radical step of construing all the atoms, this by analogy to the logical atomist, of our neutral monist model as absolute processes. So that's the step he wants to take. And this is in the sections immediately leading up to the Pantarei passage. He says, that there's a kind of factual equivalence between these two frameworks, the manifest image and the manifest image rewritten in a process in terms of absolute processes, if that could be brought off. And then he says, it would be nice to know what we mean by factual equivalence, but I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, parenthetically, I think the lesson about philosophical writing that Sellars took himself to have learned in the 70s, and that did in fact lead to more processable sort of essays, was that he didn't need to say everything at once. And there were lots of things that he should say, look, this is what I think, but I'm not going to argue for that here or even explain exactly what I mean. Follow him or not. Here are the things that matter. Someone who is an absolute stylistic master at doing that is David Lewis. And if you read the Megathology essay, well, I recommend you read the first 5 or 7 pages of it anyway. I think you'll see what I mean. But it is frustrating here that he's saying, well, I'm just not going to worry about that. There's some kind of equivalence, ramsify it, and we'll worry about it later. Okay, so that's where he's going. He wants to show us how we could reconstruct up to some level of replaceability or equivalence that we're not going to worry about much. But he says something like having the binocular vision of seeing the ordinary image and then this ontologically hygienic, nominalistic version of it. That's going to teach us philosophical lessons that will be valuable when we think about the claim that persish should be expressed in a nominalistically acceptable language. That is a language where the only ones in many are not a matter of particulars exhibiting universals or standing in relations or having facts about them, but are just being sub-processes of other processes. Now, he starts on this process, taking us from the manifest image to a version where absolute processes are the only the only ontological category we acknowledge, by first going through a discussion of an event ontology. And here, though he doesn't mention Davidson at all, Davidson already in the 70s was famous for having an event ontology. Indeed, his theory of action is embedded in his event ontology. actions are a kind of event. What kind of event are they? There was a dispute between Davidson and Jaegwon Kim over how you should identify and individuate events. We say roughly, Kim wanted to develop formally, did develop formally, a sort of common sense framework of events where my contracting the muscles in my finger is one event, and that causes another event, which is the flipping of the switch, which causes another event, which is the light going on, which causes another event, which is the alerting of the burglar, and we can have a whole causal chain of these. In Davidson's ontology, that's all one event. Under what he called the accordion principle, there's one event, and it can be described in terms of its effects. The one event sort of at base is the contraction of my muscles, but I can specify that event also in terms of its consequences. It's the event that caused the switch to flip, the light to go on, the burglar to be alerted. And there's interesting relations between these two ways of thinking about events and their relations to one another. In any case, Sellars only wants to discuss events on his way to processes, but his first claim is there aren't really any events. An event ontology would be mistaken. This is in 28 and 29. Events are not objects, that is, they're not particulars, save in that very broad sense in which anything that can be talked about is an object. Thus, the only objects properly involved in Socrates' running are Socrates himself and such other unproblematic objects as sand and gravel that he's running on. But there isn't a separate particular that is Socrates running, he's saying. With a qualification, he'll consider talk about events is a way of talking about things changing. Thus, there are no events in addition to changing things and persons. To remind us, we're in the manifest image. So he says the manifest image is an image of things, but things can change. They can undergo change. He's certainly looking back over his shoulder at the beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics here, who is one of the perennial philosophers of the manifest image in the piece in terms. So he says, there are no events in addition to changing things and persons. That's section 29. Section 30, the very next sentence is, another but closely related ontological point, there are no temporal relations. Now, here's an ontological, sort of metaphysical claim for you. There are no temporal relations. The relation of one thing being before another, Socrates running being before Socrates dining, that's not a relation. Now, you might have thought that this point would be worth an essay sort of on its own. There are no temporal relations, but things do change. What is the point here? Well, he says, there are relations are referred to by open sentences. And in 31, predicates can be construed as open sentences, but not every open sentence is a predicate. And so not every open sentence is going to express a relation for him. Obvious examples are if then. If then isn't a predicate, he says. It's a connective. It's a connective. It connects sentences. It's 32. Expressions which flank before and while in these examples are not singular terms but sentences. That's why those expressions are not relation expressions. I characterize these, this is 33, I characterize the above expressions as temporal connectives to emphasize that, like the logical connectives, they are not relation words. I now think it better to construe them as adverbs and await an adequate theory of adverbial modifiers for further illumination. And he indicates to us why you might confuse these for relations, temporal terms like before and while, as relations, because these items other than relations, whatever these things are, call them temporal connectives, exhibit features which can be thought of as characteristic of relations, like transitivity, asymmetry, and reflexiveness. So he says a real relation term, A is taller than B is taller than C, therefore A is taller than C. Here we're in 34. That's a transitive relation. But if P then Q, and if Q then R, therefore if P then R, that's transitive all right, but it's the transitivity of the connective, not of a relation, because the termini are expressed by sentences, not by singular terms. Sellars is, in the large, you can see, exploring the significance of the grammatical form of the expressions we use to pick things out for ontology and metaphysics. The new ontology is going to use only verbs and adverbs. And we saw his nominalistic objections to what I call nominalization nominalism, to nominalizing other parts of speech and nominalizing predicates by producing singular terms like greenness from them. Anyway, third example, Socrates ran before Socrates dined, and Socrates dined before Socrates slept. Therefore, Socrates ran before Socrates slept. Transitive, but he wants to say not a relation. Temporal connectives. Before exhibits transitivity, though it does not stand for a relation. That's in 35. Where he's going with this, 43, even in the context of explicit event expressions, before remains a temporal connective. 44, from this perspective, relational theories of time, taken seriously as such, involve a category mistake, as does the ontology of events. The objects introduced to serve events are the objects, scare quotes, introduced to serve as the terms of temporal relations. And he says, and that's just a mistaken way of thinking about it. Well, it involves nominalizing the sentences that are really what stand in these relations. So this, this is an argument we've seen before. So his analysis earlier in 42, the running by Socrates, so that's an event expression, was before the dining by Socrates. He says, well, really that's the running by Socrates took place before the dining by Socrates took place. Took place, occurred. You can see those are truth-like statements. That he runs was true of Socrates before that he dines was true of Socrates. That Socrates runs was true before that Socrates dines was true. Socrates runs was true before Socrates dines was true. And then we can use dot quotes. Dot Socrates runs were true, before Socrates dines were true. And now he thinks we can see the real metalinguistic character of these expressions. Expressions that relate sentences, they're metalinguistic. He's thinking of all these connectives as metalinguistic because essentially involving sentences and talk about the truth of sentences. That's all metalinguistic talk for him. So he started off with an event ontology and said, look, really there aren't any events. And events would be the things that stood in temporal relations to one another, but there aren't really any temporal relations either, if strictly we mean by a relation something that particulars can stand in to one another, because the events are really sentence nominalizations. They're metalinguistic formations, which we nominalists don't accept. But he's put here within the compass of 20 paragraphs an alternative picture, according to which it's a mistake to reconstruct the manifest image of things changing in terms of events and temporal relations among events. And he's using those three commitments that I mentioned earlier. The commitment to a metalinguistic account of these locutions, and to what's expressed by metalinguistic expressions not being in the world in the narrow sense, to argue that an event ontology is mistaken, and the very idea of temporal relations requires events as the termini, as what stand in those relations. So there are no temporal relations strictly for him. But here's the argument that he's making. And I think the argument is actually a pretty clear argument, though it may have taken us most of the term to get in a position where it could be clear to us. You sort of need the background of seeing him having argued like this before in order to do it. So he says, okay, that would be a bad reconstruction of the manifest image, though we could say Davidsonian one, though he's too polite to say that. Now let's look at a good one that still is a reconceptualization of the picture of things changing. He's going to say that's a bad picture. What there are processes. And though the paradigm of processes is things changing, that's only in the order of understanding. We get our grip on the notion of process as an alternative way of thinking about things changing that doesn't go through nominalizations of sentences or nominalizations of verbs. Socrates running, that's a gerund, a noun formed from a verb. No, we're going to look at what's expressed by verbs and by adverbs of them. Those are modifiers of them. An adverb Socrates ran slowly. That's an adverbial modifier of the verb running. That's the paradigm. That's what gives us a grip. Paradigm may be wrong. That's our epistemic access. In the order of understanding, we come to understand processes because we're working out of the manifest image that has objects that change, which we've now immunized ourselves against the mistake of understanding that in terms of events standing in temporal relations to one another. But what other account is possible? Well, ontologically basic, as opposed to first in the order of understanding, first in the order of being, is what he calls absolute processes. And these are processes that don't have objects in them that change. And he gets this instead of addressing the topic directly, I shall sidle into it, this is in 49, by considering the account of the processes expressed by those verbs, which was offered by a philosopher who has thrown as much light as anybody on problems pertaining to time. Well, it's his Oxford teacher, C.D. Broad. Sellars has here, toward the end of his career, gone back to his teachers in graduate school, to C.D. Broad. Broad introduces the concept of what he calls absolute processes, which might also be called subjectless or objectless events. These are processes, the occurrence of which is in the first instance expressed by sentences like, well, it is raining, that either don't have a subject or just have a dummy subject that we put in to use subject predicate. So he wants to say the sentences which give absolute processes their primary expression don't have the form Socrates runs, S, V's, nor can plausible paraphrases which have a genuine logical subject be found. Notice, there was lightning. He thinks, well, maybe that's a process. It's like, it is raining. There's lightning. He says, electrons jumped across the gap is not in the desired sense a paraphrase of there was lightning. We must distinguish between the questions, can all statements which are ostensibly about absolute processes be paraphrased in terms of changing things? Suppose some cannot. Well then, can the absolute processes to which they refer be explained in terms of changing things? And now we're getting a pointer towards the language of science that's authoritative about explanations. Could it be that although ontologically the best way to think about the manifest image is in terms of absolute processes, nonetheless, that's not true for the scientific image. In the scientific image, it could be changing objects, changing particulars as well. That's the second question. He says, to give a negative answer to the first question, to say no, though some processes can be expressed using a subject and a verb, there's some that can't, without introducing sort of obvious dummy placeholder terms. To give a negative answer to the first question is to grant the existence in the manifest image of absolute processes. To give an affirmative answer to the second question, that is, yes, though there are absolute processes specifiable in the manifest image, still the best ultimate explanation of them might be in terms of changing objects. terms of a non-process framework, would seem to commit one to the availability in principle of a scientific account of the world in which all processes are reduced, in the sense in which kinetic theory reduces heat to molecular motion, to processes that do have subjects. Now, needless to say, to commit oneself to the latter idea is compatible with holding that in some other sense of reduce, processes with subjects can be reduced to subjectless processes. Now, he's not actually going to give us either of those senses. Again, we've got the existential quantifiers here because he's sketching this vast program, right, for ontology. And he's saying, well, we're going to have to worry about these things if we can make sense of absolute processes. Is it conceivable that, is it intelligible that the best explanation of absolute processes in the manifest image should be processes with subjects, or even just changing objects in the scientific image? That would commit you to saying, look, even though this is a good ontology or an alternate ontology for the manifest image, not going to be the way the scientific image is. But even if we did say that, we could still admit that there's another sense in which absolute processes are not so reducible. And as I say, he's not telling us what either of those senses are, just inviting us to, well, sort of Ramsify at that point. Now, where he's going to go is to find, in the third lecture, is to find something in the manifest image that is an absolute process that cannot be explained in terms of the changes of things. And that's the pinkness of the pink ice cube. Another unaccountable, another central concern of his late years that is not obviously foreshadowed by things early on. Look, if you had asked me after the second Karas lecture, no doubt over a beer, tell me about the phases of Sellars' intellectual development, I would have said, well, there's the early Sellars before EPM. There's the middle Sellars, the core Sellars of him from EPM through the abstraction stuff through about 1962. There's late Sellars, which is the stuff kicked off with Science and Metaphysics. And this, the Karas lectures, this is the Meshuggah Sellars. Philosophers often have these four phases. And I would have cited the nominalism, the process ontology, and the confidence that quantum mechanics in the end has to be bad physics, has to be overcome, because the true physics has got to be a physics of absolute processes. And it was, those are the three characteristic features of the Meshuggah phase of Sellars' development. And part of what I'm psychoanalytically working through in the seminar here is the realization that it's all Sellars. He did not suddenly start eating magic mushrooms or losing his grip on what conclusions you could come to. I mean, I still think it's berserk for a philosopher from their armchair to think that they could give sufficient reasons to believe that physics has to take a certain shape by thinking about the contents of our visual consciousness. But that is a matter of judgment and balance, not of being completely out of it. Okay, Sellars has said all of this without so much as giving us an example of an absolute process. So maybe he's thinking of this, well, okay, now you see what turns on it, now you see what's important with it. What's an absolute process? And what's an example of one in the manifest image? And C.D. Broad said, the sound C sharp, a particular instance or trope of that sound. I should have brought a tuning fork to give us an example of it. He says, I don't mean what's always calls the dispositional features of it, that it reliably tends to bring about a certain kind of sense impression in us. That's not the sense of sound I mean. I mean the sound as a physical, well, not object, a physical process. It's a going on in the world. His preferred example, he thinks there's some problems with Broad's sound example. But one of them is, again, looking over his shoulder at the most famous process ontologist of his time, Alfred North Whitehead, 1927 philosophical masterwork was Process and Reality, had taken processes to be something that essentially and intrinsically include duration, a sort of temporal expanse. And Sellars wants to say there aren't any things like that. That's as bad as events. And the sound example of Broad invites, he thinks, us to restrict the category of absolute processes to things that have temporal duration. And he wants to insist that that's just an instance of something more abstract. To think about that, and now that's something more abstract that absolute processes could have, is what the last section of the second lecture is about. And I don't pretend to understand it. But here's what I think he's trying to do there. The key thing that's right about Broad's example is that we can think about the sub-process of that, let's say, 2-second long sounding of a C sharp from a tuning fork. We can think about the first half of that temporally as a sub-process of that, dividing it by durations. And he says the notion of a process of a going on typically has this feature of duration, temporal duration. So in the order of explanation, in the order of understanding, we're going to get a grip on absolute processes by thinking of ones that are, as we say, temporally extended, that have duration. But again, that's not essential. That's only one way in which one thing can be a sub-process of another. Another thing, what's essential about processes is that they're expressed by a certain kind of verb. And he invites us to think, by analogy to the sounding of the tuning fork, of the sound C sharp, of an expanse of red that I see. Now, not my seeing of it, but the expanse of red as a thing in the world that I see, which he wants to think of as a redding. This is to think of it as properly picked out by a verb, just as I might say, there's a C sharping in the corner to report the sound that I heard. I might say, and there's a redding over there. It's redding over there. Indeed, as I look at the brick, I can see, but my seeing it isn't the important thing, it's what's there, that it's redding rectangularly. When he uses that adverbial modifier, he puts a exclamation point after it, acknowledging that this is a sort of strange thing, strange expression. That redding rectangularly that's over there is a process, but it's not essentially one with duration. If it's to be perceptible by me, maybe it has to last a certain time, but the way in which it has sub-processes is sub-reddings. For instance, the left half of that redding, rectangularly, is a redding squarely. And it's a sub-process of that absolute process. It's absolute because there's not anything that is redding rectangularly. It's just the redding rectangularly. Just as he says, though there might be some subject that is buzzing, the bee that produces it, there needn't be. We can just talk about the buzzing, the sound, in the way we can talk about the C sharping that's there. So what he's after is a notion of absolute processes as not properly paraphrasable as the changing of an object, not properly expressible by SVs, but just by the V. And he's using these gerundive forms. Redding is a singular term formed from a verb, but he really means the verb. It's just a surface expression of these. What we're after, as he said in section 100, 102 there, is a world whose basic states are expressible just using verbs and adverbs. And he's after a notion of process abstract enough that duration is not an essential feature of them. Now, his discussion of this more abstract notion of, I'm suggesting we focus on the sub-process relation, which need not be a temporal, need not be that process sort of limited in duration, as it isn't in the case of the left half of the redding there. He embeds his positive discussion of that in the last section of this second Keras lecture, in a diatribe warning us against the spatialization of time, thinking of a period of time as a length of time. And this is a theme that he's picked up from Henri Bergson, though he's going other places with it than Bergson did. But walking back as philosophers of the manifest image, perennial philosophers, have done, Galileo's gigantic step forward, which was precisely spatializing time as a step, thinking of time, of a period of time as represented by the length of a line, on his way to being able to think of velocities as the areas of triangles, of accelerations also as areas, but the spatialization of time, walking that back. I wish I could boil down his argument and insight about the spatialization of time in the way I hope I did his claim that there really are no events and there's no temporal relations. There I can sort of see, okay, this is the argument. This is how the argument goes. This is the mistake he's warning us against. And here are the premises that he uses to do it. I can't do that for that discussion of the spatialization of time. And I can't extract clear claims about what the relation of subprocesses of which processes that are temporal restrictions, subduration of other processes. The first minute of the 2-minute buzzing, that's a subprocess by restriction of duration, but he has this more abstract notion of subprocess such that in generically the same sense, the left half of the Reading rectangularly that is that the brick is presenting in the physical world is a subprocess of the Reading rectangular. Yeah.
Does he mean to say that the two are really just like two of the same thing? Because I'm thinking like if I have my red block, but it also becomes orange over time, then there's a sense in which both you can do both, right? But if you don't have that, then you just have the one. So surely there should be some difference between the two.
Well, and also the durations are only one-dimensional. I can take the left half of the Reading or the top half of it, and those are different subprocesses that overlap, and we could have different restrictions in the temporal one, but not that could be sort of orthogonal like that. So there are going to be differences between them, and the question is, well, how do we characterize the genus of which these are species? And there's sort of spatial and temporal dimensions, but I don't think he thinks those are the only ones. And it's clear what sort of really understanding this would come to. You'd be able to get a mereology out of it. You'd be able to formalize what this subprocess relation is. I think you can do that if you just said, well, it's temporal or spatial restriction of the process. But as you just indicated, it can easily be qualitative as well, even though there aren't any properties, so we're going to have to be careful about that. But suppose over time it became oranger, and then less orange, and then oranger again. Are the orangey bits, even though they're temporally and maybe spatially separated, are they a subprocess, a single subprocess? Is that okay? That's the sort of question we'd have to ask to do a real mereology with it and get a notion, a process ontology we could really work with. Now, Johanna Seibt, who I mentioned before, has got process mereologies, sort of more than one, that some of which she developed to interpret what Sellars was after, but others of which she's just been exploring what the possibilities of such a thing are. She has an article on process ontologies either in the Stanford Encyclopedia or maybe on Wikipedia even. I hope it's in Stanford, in which she talks about the pre-Whitehead history of process ontology and the recent ones. But in at least one of the articles of hers that I put in the supplementary reading, there's references to her worked out process mereologies. So, look, let me break off here because I've run past our break time. Let's come back at 2:47. Okay. Well, what I've been trying to do is get clear about what Sellars is trying to do and what role these different notions is being taken to play in his overall story. So, what is the ontology of absolute processes for? What work is it supposed to do? How is it supposed to fit into his overall account? And in broadest terms, the claim is there's an awful lot that a nominalist needs to reconstruct with the very spare conceptual raw materials that they permit themselves. There's a whole lot of stuff nominalists say isn't really there, but they've got to account for a lot of appearances, indeed, ultimately, all the conceptual appearances that we have. And his candidate for doing that is the notion of absolute processes and the way in which they can have sub-processes or contain each other. I can read you what Seibt says about this because it's suggestive, and if you're concerned to pursue it, give you some hint of what you might find in her. She quotes Sellars as saying that what she calls the dynamicity of processes we're to think of as a continuous coming to be and ceasing to be, which can be cognitively responded to in terms of spatiotemporal dimension, duration, or spatial extent, but which as such occurs outside the spatiotemporal dimension, that is, which is ontologically independent of such a response. That was from section 122 of the essay. She says, precisely how we're to understand the envisaged continuous coming to be and ceasing to be remains obscure. What does become clear, however, is that the dynamicity of an absolute process involves the repeated presence of a qualitative feature. That's the way we put it, speaking with the vulgar. This suggests that the individuation of absolute processes no longer can rely upon criteria for particular entities, namely spatiotemporal position, if we were thinking of the dynamicity as the change of a spatiotemporal object, but is now to operate with the criteria for non-particulars, that is, functional or causal role. So she thinks that the move beyond particulars, well, what else is there in his world? There are these functional descriptions, there's causal roles of things. So presumably it's not normative functional role, but another notion. I find that tantalizing and suggestive anyway. Thus we receive the notion of a dynamic entity with the following descriptor set. It is a purely or completely actual entity in the sense of consisting entirely in the production of an intrinsic character, concrete in the sense of being causally related, occurrent in space and time but not individuated by its spatiotemporal location, i.e. non-particular, possibly complex, possibly itself a constituent of physical objects. We're to understand objects ultimately in terms of these things. Given the descriptive differences between the model and the new category gained by analogical projection, Sellars' usage of the term absolute process for both model, coming out of broad, and category is bound to create some confusion. Absolute process is the label for the new category of dynamic, non-particular items, while the model entities of absolute processes are particulars, a buzzing, for instance, thus themselves not really absolute processes, but particular occurrences of spatiotemporal amounts thereof. Again, can't say that I understand this. This was from 280, but I mean, I pass it on because she understands something that I don't understand from this, and this might motivate you to look. That was from page 280 of the first essay of hers I put on the website. A few pages later on, 284, she says, according to the Karras lectures, we can discern from within our present framework a well-motivated trend in the series of ontological theories that leads from traditional substance ontological schemes operating with concrete, particular, static, and causally separate entities, as well as abstract and general entities, to schemes whose basic entities are concrete, non-particular, dynamic, and causally interlaced or overlapping. That's her characterization. And as I say, if you want to know more about that, that's why I put those two essays there. Now, I think one fascinating take on this that bypasses some of the metaphysical heavy lifting, but is still articulating the same, I think, ontologically deep insight, is from the Simonelli essay. He's explaining at the end how one might think of processes like this as more fundamental than the objects changing that we're ultimately to understand in terms of them. He says, this is towards the end of his essay, I've been implicitly working in this framework here, but now let me lay it out explicitly. Happenings, which is his preferred term, on Sellars' conception of them, are particulars through and through. They're sortable, but their sortability is not mediated by their instantiation of general properties. So, there may be one phying at one time and place, and another distinct phying at a different time and place. Here the thought is, we have two particular phyings, both classifiable as such in virtue of what they do, the difference they make in a world of other happenings. This, I think, is a useful unpacking of what Seibt was talking about as a functional or causal role individuation rather than a fundamentally spatiotemporal one. We may say, for instance, still Simonelli, that a fying at a particular time and place excludes a sighing at that time and place, necessitates a sighing at some other time and place, and so on. So he's thinking of them as able to stand in consequential and incompatibility relations, sort of causal such relations, and so on. The world, according to Sellars' final ontological picture, is a world of such happenings, which, though particulars, regularly unfold in certain patterns, and so are classifiable as happenings of different sorts. Now, I think that's just right, with the caveat that unfold is supposed to have this more abstract category that needn't entail that there's a temporal duration for it. I mean, that's dark, but he's going to use these paradigmatic things. I'm just going to read some more I've pulled out from here. He tells us how to think about the two sides of the picturing relation this way. Remember, we need regularities, Sellars says, among the languagings, the sign designs, the natural linguistic objects, to be isomorphic with the regularities that govern the things that are really in the world. And now we're supposed to think of both of those sets of things, the things that stand to each other, well, in relations of regularity is not going to be right, but that we're looking at regularities of as processes, both on the side of talking and on the side of the world, because we're thinking about picturing as characterized in persish. Simonelli says, I've been implicitly appealing to this ontological picture in order to speak of our own discursive acts, specifically our own languagings, abstractly characterizable as saying that P's or saying that Q's. That's to be the kind of sighing and fying that he says, because of the role, of the causal role in necessitating some other kind of sighing and excluding some other kind of crying. That's what's individuating them. And he's saying, and that's true of the sayings that P, the sayings that Q. According to my analysis, such acts are ultimately identified simply in terms of what it is to do them, in terms of their role in linguistic practice, well thought about with the causal roles that are induced by the normative roles. So we're over on the causal side. And so characterizable intrinsically as sayings of distinctive sorts without any appeal to the distinctive propositional contents that are said. On the linguistic side, we're not to have contents common to one and the other. That would be like a property, a universal that's shared. We're to look at the patterns of causal roles that they play. The act of saying that P on this account is characterized simply as a doing of a certain sort, identified in terms of the difference it makes among other linguistic doings, precluding or mandating them. Accordingly, one needs only to speak of particular sayings that P's, characterized in terms of their linguistic roles, without needing to speak of any abstract propositional content picked out by the phrase that P, or some abstract relation one stands into the propositional content that is said. So he's telling us how to do without propositions. He's going to have to tell us how to do without facts as well in these terms. These sayings on this conception are simply happenings of a certain variety, identified in terms of their role among happenings of the same variety, excluding or necessitating them, where those happenings are conceived from within the practice as doings governed by normative relations of preclusive and committive consequence. That's the norms that are inducing these causal roles. Discursive beings such as ourselves can be identified as loci of happenings of this variety. So, to respond to Brandom's challenge with an example near and dear to his heart, the criteria of application for the sortal term discursive being to us, conceived of as those who say we, can be articulated directly in terms of the patterns of happenings specifically languagings, intelligible only as norm-governed doings that unfold wherever you have one of us. But on the side of the world, applied to, say, lions, consider now the example of something in the world, external to ourselves and to our own acts, to which we might apply this ontological picture, a particular lion, say. According to this picture, something's being a lion is not its instantiating the general kind lionhood. Rather, it's doing what lions do, being the locus of the patterns of processes that unfold in the world wherever you have a lion. So, to be a lion is to eat gazelles, to bear live young, to reflect light with certain frequencies, the tawniness, and so on. In this context, the criteria for the application of the sortal term lion to some particular lion, conceived of in terms of the pattern of processes that unfolds wherever you have a lion, can be articulated directly in terms of processes. So we're to think about those processes as basic, and the lion reconstructed as something like the overlap of the lion constituting processes. Sentences that articulate the conceptual content of the expressions lion, such as lions are tawny, lions are carnivorous, lions have 4 legs, and so on, can be reconceived, according to this final ontological picture, as functioning to regiment the language, such that the patterns of the use of these expressions track the patterns of processes that unfold wherever you have a lion. Speaking of the color of lions with the use of tawnies, tracks a certain pattern of processes that unfolds whenever you have a lion. Speaking of the eating habits of lions with carnivorouses, tracks a different pattern, and so on. This notion of linguistic items tracking of certain patterns in the world is understood in terms of the fact that the patterns of languagings correspond as a whole to the patterns of happenings in the world, necessitating and excluding one another as the corresponding happenings in the world do with respect to one another. With this holistic correspondence in view, we can speak of the language picturing the world. Okay, that's the end of the quotes from Simonelli that I find most helpful here. I think what I find most helpful about this is, well, it's a semi-concrete indication of how you might go about reconstruing objects in terms of the characteristic processes that they engage in. So we think of what speaking with the vulgar manifest image we talk about as a lion, as in terms of the overlap, the sub-process that's involved in its eating, its reflecting light, its moving around the way it does, and so on. Those processes ultimately thought of as subjectless. The subjects who change, the lion that's hungry and then is not, that's supposed to be a convoluted and misleading way of talking about these ultimately subjectless processes. That's the image. And the kinds, shouldn't call them kinds, he says sorts, the ones in many that group together these processes are a holistic matter of the way this grouping interacts with this other grouping. Wherever there's a lioning, there's a carnivorousing, and their exclusions of one another, the causal roles. So this is the functional analysis that Seibt was talking about, is we have this network of ones in many, individuated by their functional relations to one another, thought it was causal relations, of inclusion and exclusion, consequence and exclusion, where what we think of them as, where the manys that they are ones in, are thought of as subjectless processes, absolute processes. And the thought is that's what Persish is going to tell us the final story about. And it's not going to have to use all the talk that goes with subject-predicate forms. Even, this is a kind of nominalism, process nominalism isn't really a nominalism because there aren't supposed to be names in it. It's just verbs and adverbs. It's nominalistic only in that it makes common cause with traditional nominalists in rejecting talk about properties, universals, and so on. But in the end, it throws over the notion of particulars as well. I mean, that's a point that I think Simonelli is not being as careful with as he might. He's still thinking of process nominalism as insisting that the world consists only of particulars. And we're actually supposed to get beyond that too. I talked about nominalization, nominalism. Even singular terms aren't the right sort of expression to cut at the ontological joints in this. So process nominalism is a sort of Pickwickian phrase. It's not properly a nominalism at all because it's processes, not particulars. They're causal functional roles or something like that. Now, all of this, I remind you, is downstream from a commitment to saying that the world we understand by talking is not itself in conceptual shape. That's the view of Sellars Kant, because concepts are products of our activity, they're principles of synthesis of human understanding, and things in themselves aren't in that shape. That's the big divide with Hegel, who says, no, the world as it is, independently of the existence of thinkers, has to be understood as already in conceptual shape. Now that, of course, has its own difficulties, but next time I'll talk about what we might say about how we might address some of those difficulties. But Sellars takes very seriously that if your picture is one of conceptual appearance of a non-conceptual world, that the challenge of understanding how, nonetheless, what we do conceptually can be intelligible as understanding how the world is, requires some real work. How do you get over this boundary? Now, I mentioned Hegel as saying, well, by saying there is no boundary characterizable as the conceptual meeting the non-conceptual, someone else who's put that at the center of their views is John McDowell. That's what Mind and World is about. And he says if you think of the world as not already coming in conceptual shape, then it is not intelligible that we could genuinely know how anything is or understand things as they are. And he acknowledges that to do that is to move in Hegel's direction from from Kant as well. But Sellars takes that challenge head on. How and furthermore pursues it in the context of a set of commitments about what that non-conceptual world really is like. If it's non-conceptual, then nothing that we say with essentially metalinguistic expressions can pick out anything that's in that world. That's the material world in the narrow sense, is the world as it would be or could be if there never had been language users. And anything that's metalinguistic is not talking about that world because there's no language for it to be meta to in that world. And given his expansive characterization, analysis of linguistic expressions as covertly metalinguistic, so that any sort of transcategorial nominalization originally is metalinguistic, that puts severe constraints on what we can have. And the view he ends up with ends up speculating about, gesturing at, is a view where even the notion of what's expressed by names, particulars, is, though not metalinguistic, is not in the world in the narrow sense. He doesn't work out this pure process ontology, which is still a very spare notion of ones in many, that is all one has to reconstruct the manifest image as an image of it. Barely scratches the surface. Ars longa vita brevis. Art takes a long time. Our lives are short. So much being, so little time. We see sort of how far Sellars brought this line of thought, and leaving it to be worked on by anybody who thinks it's interesting enough to work on. As I say, Seibt has given us a head start on some of it. Okay, next time I'll start addressing another issue that Sellars left undeveloped, and that is in the Scientia Mensura slogan, we've said it really should say, in the dimension of describing and explaining material objects, science is the measure of all things that they are, and of all things that are not, that they are not. That restriction to the material is a more accurate expression of his meaning and the commitment that he's making. But what is the dimension of describing and explaining? That is, we saw him arguing, and this goes deep into his understanding of language, that genuine description, as opposed to mere labeling or classification, as opposed to mere differential response, has to involve situation in a space of implications. And it's because those implications have to at least include subjunctively robust ones those are the ones that you can appeal to in explanation, in explaining why one description applies because some other one does. So that's why describing and explaining advance hand in hand, as he said in CDCM. So that's the dimension of describing and explaining. Well, at least that's a necessary condition of its being describing and explaining, that things are situated in a space of implications that supports subjunctive or counterfactual reasoning. But is that a sufficient condition? Well, normative claims about what somebody ought to do are situated in a space of implications. We use them in practical reasoning. We use them in theoretical reasoning. And those can be subjunctively robust. If that's a morally awful thing to do, then you shouldn't do it. Those things embed, that's expressing implication, relations among them in a subjunctively robust way. He needs to exclude that from the descriptive dimension that he's talking about. That's saying that situation in a space of implications, which really is his notion of conceptual contentfulness generally, that's casting the net too wide. Natural science isn't supposed to be authoritative about that. These norms, this absolutely is much true of norms of etiquette, which clearly are not in the world in the narrow sense. If there weren't talkers, there would not be rude talkers. And yet, they're in a space of implications. For that claim to be sensible, he needs to restrict it somehow. Describing has to be not the only thing you can do with sentences that stand in implication relations to one another. I'm not aware of anywhere where he addresses this issue, but I think he gives us all the raw materials we need to address it. And I want to argue that when we assemble them to do that, it sort of puts pressure on the notion of the world that we're describing not being in conceptual shape. At any rate, this is the way I want to get there. But I'm taking this issue of what's descriptive in a narrower sense as one of the bits left over from filling in the picture he's given us. Doing that is responding to what Hugh Price calls the bifurcation challenge of saying what that narrower sense of representation, description, or fact stating is. So that's where I'll start. Well, next time, not next week because we have a holiday break next week. I'm hoping you can sort of recover this current state of play in 2 weeks for us to go forward. Yeah,
A question about how you think one should express Sellars' process ontology. I'm thinking of in what language, what kind of language should one do it? I guess I'm thinking, well, if one uses the language with quantifiers over objects, well then it's not perspicuous in what sense we aren't quantifying over events and having an ontology of events. So I was wondering if you think that like Quine's predicate functor logic would be a more appropriate language, or whether
well, certainly not given the model theoretic semantics that is important to Quine that he can give for it. I mean, what Sellars says is that it would be a language that only had verbs and verb modifiers in it. Now, it's a challenge for us coming from a subject-verb natural languages to say, well, yes, it's just like that, except there's no terms in it. There's only the verbs. Remember Whitehead warning us against the fallacy of misplaced, of lost contrast, where you say, well, you take something where we only understand A's in terms of non-A's, and you say, well, but the thing is, everything's an A. And then you say, well, but now I don't understand what you mean by that. And so there's a job of work to be done in making this verb and adverb only language, and in identifying what's in it as a verb, even though it doesn't contrast with nouns, which seems rather essential to the thing. But he's thinking of this ladder to climb up to get to the new thing. It's a language with expressions that only pick out, I think we could say, processes. And it's got to be able to specify the sub-process relation, which is the same as saying when two processes add up to a third. We can go back and forth between those. So insofar as the generic term for that is mereology, it's a mereological language. But thinking of these as processes gives a special twist to that and puts special constraints on it. It's a process mereology, which is the name under which Seibt has produced some such.
Does that mean that there's really only one process and that everything can be understood in terms of sub-processes?
No, only if, as in Goodmanian mereology, you could always put any set of processes together to get one that included them. And he doesn't say anything like that. So there needn't be some one world process. I mean, maybe there is, but from what we've seen here, he's not committed to that. And indeed, that I suggested that the promiscuity with which one can put parts together to make up a whole in traditional mereology is one of the reasons that someone with nominalistic inclinations might object to traditional mereology. Okay, well, have a happy and safe holiday. See you in 2 weeks.